Hi everybody, my name is Deborah Alexander and I'm going to do the introduction and the housekeeping. There's water out the back, the exits through here and out to the car park if there's an emergency, and there are toilets down the corridor. $550 billion is the cost for net zero. Professor Michael Kelly examined the impacts on New Zealand of meeting its net zero target and finds that by 2050 the cost will comfortably exceed $550 billion. And this was done, I think, in 2020. It would also require a workforce comparable in size to the health sector. And that will be required for 30 years. It includes a doubling of the present number of electrical engineers, and it will be about 10% of the global annual production of lithium, cobalt, neodymium, and other minerals. So that's the cost. He also did the costing for the UK, and then after the UK, he did it for New Zealand. So that's the cost. So we do cost analysis. We need to look at the benefit. We need to know how much warming methane is doing, so we can decide whether this is a feasible outlay of funds. So Groundswell New Zealand and the Methane Science Accord are grateful Dr. William Happer has made the time to come to New Zealand for this series of events to talk about climate change, emissions, and what it means to both the future of farming in New Zealand and for all New Zealanders. Dr. Happer is an emeritus professor of Princeton University and the former chair of their Department of Physics. And I'm not good at this. I forgot to mention welcome to Barbara Kuriga for being here, and members of Federated Farmers. Sorry, carry on. He was the director of the US Department of Energy's Office of Science from 1991 to 1993, and still often advises the US government on national science and technology issues. Dr. Happer has made waves in recent years with his research on climate change, or greenhouse gas radiation, and experiences with the world of climate research and government policy making. As New Zealand's government and media continues to focus on how to tax emissions, including agricultural emissions, to meet the Paris Agreement commitments, Dr. Happer's visit is a welcome addition to the debate. And that is what it is. It should be an open debate. There is no such thing as a silly question, either positive or negative, in the forums that we are presenting at. And the questions will be handled with respect, whichever side of that you have thoughts on. We have a small donation box if anybody wants to contribute. Little red box up here. We are sponsoring it through Groundswell and the Methane Science Accord. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Happer.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thanks to Groundswell and to Methane Science Accord for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. My wife Barbara's in the back corner there, and she's excited to be here with me. So we already had a wonderful 2 days in New Zealand for our first visit. So I'm going to talk about cattle, greenhouse gases, and climate, because I was just in Europe for a few weeks talking to ranchers and farmers in Spain, and about similar pressures that they're experiencing. But let me give you some reassurances. I think this craze, this fanaticism, is close to the end of its life, and I've been watching it now for 20 or 30 years, and I'm more encouraged now than I've ever been. I didn't think I would live to see it end, but I think I may now. So let's talk about greenhouse gases, methane in particular, and cattle. Cattle have been demonized because they can't avoid burping methane when they chew their cud, and we should be grateful for that, as we'll discuss in more detail. But if you actually put in the numbers, what does this really mean in terms of something that matters to us? We don't care what methane is in the room, it's temperature. And the answer is that temperature effects are unbelievably small. Why be modest about saving the planet, just keeping cows from burping a little methane? Let's kill them all. There are 1.5 billion cows in the world. I looked it up carefully, and if you killed all those cattle so they don't emit any methane, none at all, how much do you lower the temperature? 0.07 C. 0.07 C from killing them all. Not just feeding them poison so they don't burp methane. So you have to think, is this really a good deal? And the answer, of course, no, it's crazy. This whole field is crazy. But it's not the first time that poor old cows have been under threat. This is Nongawusi, who was a prophet of the Xhosa tribe in South Africa. And she had visions in 1856, around that time, that if her people would kill all of their cattle, it would solve all their problems. And you can read here what this says. This is from the internet. Their ancestors would rise, bringing back all their cattle. They would be free of disease, and it would drive the white settlers into the sea. And by the way, she was the same age as Greta Thunberg. Okay, but she was taken seriously, just like politicians around the world take seriously this nonsense about climate. And the result was that they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of cattle in South Africa. Roughly 80,000 Xhosa people died of starvation. The whole society collapsed. They've not fully recovered to this day. This is a historical fact. And the basis for net zero is about as firm as the basis for what the Xhosas did. There's nothing to it. So let's move forward. So now here's the outline. You have to forgive me. I'm an old professor, so I'm used to lecturing to students, and you're all students for me today. And I will. And I'm a professional physicist, so I tend to be pretty nerdy. And I'll try and limit that, and Deborah will stop me if I get too far off. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about biochemistry, which is why cows have to emit methane. You can't properly use the capabilities of the cow unless it's emitting methane. Then I'm going to revert to physics for a brief time and tell you a little bit about how global warming works and why methane almost doesn't make any difference. There's not much debate about this amongst people who know how to calculate things like this, and lots of people do, but not in the climate science field. And finally, at the end, I'll look forward to taking questions. Okay, so what's this thing not in? Is it Nancy here? You'll have to pardon me a minute. I don't know why this is not in Nancy. Okay. Damn it. Okay. All right, so here, this is a physicist's picture of a cow. And the most striking thing about a cow is that it can digest fibrous material in the hay and the grass that normal animals can't do. And the cow can do this. I shouldn't be telling you, most of you know more than I do about how a cow works, but it works because of the rumen microflora, all sorts of microorganisms ranging from fungi to bacteria to archaea, even some protists in there. And under the conditions of the rumen, which are anoxic, there's practically no oxygen in a cow's rumen, these microorganisms break down the cellulose that we cannot digest and produce useful organic chemicals which the cow converts into milk and meat and other things that are so useful to us. So, but in the process of doing that, it inevitably has to release methane. You can't be a cow without burping methane. So let's see if this switch is done, okay? Now the basis for all life, or almost all life on Earth, or a few exceptions, is photosynthesis. And photosynthesis takes the energy from sunlight. It then uses that energy to combine carbon dioxide and from the air and water from the soil to make sugar. And that's the primary product of photosynthesis. And a waste product from this is the oxygen that goes off into the air. And you can think of the little chloroplast in the green leaf as two little factories that are working simultaneously. The first factory takes light and uses the energy from the light to strip hydrogen atoms off of water molecules that have been sucked up from the roots. And those hydrogen atoms are carried by a special chemical, NADPH, over to a second factory that's going to turn that into sugar. And in addition, this light capture factory produces energy which is transported by another chemical, ATP, to the second factory. Now the second factory is often called the Calvin cycle, that takes carbon dioxide from the air and takes the hydrogen that has been stripped off the water in the first factory and puts them together to make sugar, which is, it looks as though it were just a carbon attached to a water, but it's a carbon with an OH on one side and an H on the other. So these two are operating in tandem to support all life on Earth. And the particular factory here is run by an enzyme called ribisco. Ribisco is the most abundant protein on Earth. You know, if you ask, well, that's not surprising because all life depends on plant photosynthesis, so it's not surprising that the key enzyme is the most abundant protein. We'll come back to this in a minute, but this is an acronym for a long, complicated name. It's ribose 1,5-bisphosphate carboxylase, oxylase. But the C and the O refer to something that's important, and one of the reasons that increasing carbon dioxide is actually good for the Earth. It's not bad for the Earth, but it's attached to the last two letters. Now those sugar molecules, 3 carbon sugars, are quickly stuck together to make 6 carbon sugars, glucose. Glucose can actually be a linear molecule like this, but most of the time it is bitten, it's in here and forms a ring. And the ring that you form can have one of the OHs below the plane of the ring or above the plane of the ring. And that doesn't matter to us. You know, the glucose in our blood is about 1/3 this type of glucose, and it's about 2/3 this type of glucose, and a fraction of a percent is the straight chain. But they interconvert easily, and they both are fine for digestion. The problem is that most of these sugar molecules are polymerized into long chains. And if you polymerize the alpha glucose, you make things like starch, maltose, which again are easy to digest. So, for example, if you eat starchy food, it's quite easy to break the starch down into simple sugars that are nice and sweet. But if it's beta glucose, it polymerizes into cellulose, into the fiber that goes into leaves and hay and stuff like that, which we can't digest, but which cattle can with the aid of the microorganisms in their rumen. And you can see the beta glucose, it has a somewhat different structure. It alternates up and down, and that produces strong hydrogen bonds between adjacent units like this. And this is almost impossible to break apart. So it's quite easy to break these down into sugar again, but it's quite difficult to break wood into sugar. You know, you can eat all the sawdust you like, it won't give you any nourishment, but you get nourishment if you're a cow from sawdust. It's not too much. Okay. So the overall biochemistry that's going on is that in the gut of the cow, in the rumen of the cow, microorganisms are able to break apart these carbohydrate monomers, and the most energy you can get out of that under the conditions of the rumen where there's no oxygen is to make one molecule of methane, one molecule of CO2. So you can't be an efficient cow unless these are the end products. Now, if it were oxidizing, you would burn this methane and get a little more, biological energy, but you can't do that because there's no oxygen. And the reason there's no oxygen is the oxygen kills the very enzymes, the very organisms that break apart the cellulose, the fiber. So they find oxygen poisonous, and that's why the cow has to keep the oxygen out of its belly, out of its rumen. This damn thing. And so that's the reason for the demonization. As I said, the cow has to emit methane to efficiently digest fodder, and methane is a greenhouse gas, and so methane will cause some warming. So the whole demonization is based on the warming caused by this methane that comes out of the cow's mouth, chewing its cud. You ought to wonder a little bit about that, because if you look at the number of cattle in the world today, there are a lot of cows. I mentioned there are 1.5 billion cows today in the world. It's slowly increasing. People are more wealthy, especially in India and China, but there are not more ruminants than there used to be. So in my country, before the Europeans came, there were huge herds, millions of buffalo in the Great Plains, and they ate almost all fibrous food, so they didn't have any grain or silage. And so they almost certainly produced much more methane than domesticated cattle do today in my country. So most people, when they try to analyze the effects, what the buffaloes might have done compared to livestock today, think that probably cows, at least in North America, are emitting less methane than when the Europeans first came, and we had all these wild ruminants and very low quality food, Okay, so now we're going to talk about physics. And a few facts. And the first fact that is very important is that there is no single temperature of the Earth. That's particularly striking if you go up above us here. And what you find is the temperature drops very rapidly. That's why people like to go to the mountains for a summer vacation, because it's cool up higher. And that drop is quite severe. So when you get to 10 kilometers, roughly where jet planes like to fly, the temperature is around minus 50 degrees, 50, 60 degrees Celsius. And I was interested to watch the flight recorder when we came from San Francisco to New Zealand a couple days ago, and the outside temperature was pretty well stuck at minus 50 degrees the whole flight across the Pacific, because we were flying our airplane at just this altitude where the temperature drop stops. And this is quite important. Most of the energy transfer from the surface, from the solar heated surface out to space, is in this first 10 kilometers, and there it has nothing to do with radiation. It's almost all due to rising and falling packets of warm air and cold air, so it's convective. This is sort of like an air fryer oven, you know. That's the way the heat is transferred. Once you get above this point here, then essentially all the heat transfer from here upward is from radiation. And that's where greenhouse gases really are important, but most of the work has already been done at 10 kilometers. So anyway, the takeaway message is there's no single temperature, even going up and down, much less going from the North Pole to the equator to the South Pole. The Earth doesn't have a single temperature. Now, how does the greenhouse effect work? Well, this comfortable temperature we live in is a balance between the sun heating the surface of the Earth during the daytime, like now, and the release of this energy from the sun back into outer space by infrared radiation. We can't see infrared radiation. We can see sunlight without any problem. Infrared radiation we can't. And this, you can't do much about the sunlight's power coming in. The sun does what it wants to do, and maybe it's changing. That's an interesting scientific question. It's quite possible that most of the real climate change may have something to do with the changes of the sun. Well, that's not very important now. But this radiation is very strongly dependent on the surface temperature. So as the surface warms, you get more and more thermal radiation going to space. If it cools, you get less and less. So what the surface does is it warms up to just the temperature that exactly compensates the heating from the sun. And then this temperature dependence is extremely fast. It's the fourth power of the absolute temperature. And so you don't have to vary temperature very much to compensate for lots of other things. So it's quite difficult to change the temperature of the Earth's surface because the thermal radiation is so sensitive to temperature. Okay, so that's the greenhouse effect. Not quite, because I neglected to talk about what happens if you put in methane, CO2, water vapor. This is for no greenhouse gases, no water vapor, no methane. When you put in real atmospheres that have water vapor, then those molecules, greenhouse molecules, absorb the infrared radiation. They don't absorb sunlight. They're transparent to sunlight, but they absorb infrared. So these infrared photons, instead of going straight out to space, they go a little distance and then they get trapped and turned back into heat. And then they are re-emitted at some higher altitude by a greenhouse molecule, go a little further, but get trapped again. I shouldn't say trapped, they get annihilated. You know, if you've ever taken any physics, one of the amazing things about photons, they actually can be annihilated and created. They're not conserved. And so you can kind of see from this that greenhouse gases make it harder to get this heat radiation back to space, because it has to make lots of stops and starts, and sometimes it reverses direction to get out. And so this causes the Earth to be warmer than it normally would be if it were a pure atmosphere, and thermal radiation could get out unimpeded. Now let's see if this will advance. So now I'm going to give you a little break and talk about personalities briefly. And the two personalities are Max Planck, who was a very famous German physicist, died right after World War II. Rather tragic. During World War II, Max Planck's son was executed by the Nazis because he was allegedly involved in a plot to kill Hitler. And the other is Karl Schwarzschild, who again was affected by war, but in this case it was World War I, and he died on the Russian front in 1916, but both had major contributions to radiation transfer theory. And Planck was particularly famous because at the time he began working on physics, a few physicists who really looked carefully, realized that classical physics didn't work. That if you took what was known about thermodynamics and about electromagnetic radiation, and both were very well understood, if you then calculated the thermal radiation we were just talking about, you found that the amount was infinite. So that, of course, it's crazy. It's clearly not infinite, but that was a clear prediction of classical physics. So there was a real problem in classical physics in 1890, about the time he began his work. And everyone knew there must be something wrong with the theory, but no one knew how to fix it. And so Planck finally figured out how to do it, and that was the birth of quantum mechanics. So the way you fix it is you finally realize that radiation cannot come out in any old amount of energy it won't. It has to come out as quanta. So Max Planck is the inventor of quantum mechanics, and it's interesting that that invention came from exactly the same physics that's involved in global warming, climate change, or allegedly involved. And so Planck's contribution then was to show that if you assume that radiation is quantized, that you get a predicted blue curve like this, which is very close to what's observed, but not quite. If you actually observe what the Earth is emitting, and they couldn't do that very well in Planck's days, but we do that easily today with satellites, the radiation going out to space is a little bit less than the Planck curve. There are regions, this is called the atmospheric window, where this jagged black curve, which is the observed curve from satellites, is exactly almost on the Planck curve. And then there are regions here where CO2 molecules absorb, water molecules absorb, where a lot less radiation gets to space. And so the total radiation to space is the area under these two curves. So the blue curve, that's the maximum radiation you can get at a given temperature. And these jagged curves are what you actually get. And it's about a 30% difference. So because of greenhouse gases, Earth radiates about 30% less energy than it could if the greenhouse gases weren't there at all. Now, this physics is very firmly established. There's just no question about it. And the details were first worked out by Schwarzschild for stars, for the sun in particular. So these curves were first generated to try to understand, when you look at the spectrum of the sun reaching the Earth, it has zigs and zags in it just like the Earth spectrum does. They were called Fraunhofer lines, and so his achievement then was to explain the Fraunhofer line. So looking at this as an astrophysicist, you would say, well, this is a Fraunhofer line for carbon dioxide, this is one for ozone, etc. Now, okay. What I've done is I've got three colors, jagged line colors. And the black jagged line color is what you observe radiation going to space at current concentrations of CO2. Now, if you were to double CO2 concentrations, that's a 100% increase. It almost doesn't matter. You change this black curve to the red curve here. You have to kind of squint to see that these are not the same. They're exactly the same over most of the frequencies here. This is frequency of the radiation going here. This is the intensity of radiation going up here. And the takeaway message here is that huge increases of CO2 almost don't make any difference. It's a 100% increase in CO2, 1% decrease of radiation to space. Well, radiation to space decreases, the Earth has to warm a little bit to avoid being overheated by the sun. And we'll come back to the quantitative amount of that warming, but it's not very much. And the same thing happens if you change the amount of methane, which we'll talk about in a minute, or nitrous oxide, or any of the other greenhouse gases. Now, you might wonder, how do we know that this is true? Is it because a bunch of bright people have gotten together and voted to make it true? The answer is no. It's because it agrees with what you observe, you know, so this is not scientific consensus. There's no such thing as scientific consensus. This is because what you calculate is what you observe. And so here's an example of calculations on the left model, satellite observations on the right. Okay, and those of you who are not familiar with, so familiar with graphs as others, no, first thing you should do when you look at a graph is actually look at the numbers on the scale. And so, for example, if you look at this, this is a measurement, or at least this is a measurement over the Sahara Desert where it's very hot. So this scale goes from 0 to 200. This is a measurement over Antarctica in the winter where it's very cold. And this only goes from 0 to, what, 40, 50 or so. So there's very little radiation coming up from Antarctica. There's a lot of radiation coming up from the Sahara. Here's the Mediterranean region. But if you compare what's calculated and what's observed, calculated, observed, calculated, observed, it's very hard to tell the difference. The takeaway message is that we really know how to calculate radiation transfer from the Earth. You know, there's not much mystery there. And this is a kind of an interesting point here. If you look over Antarctica, the amount of radiation that would come to space if you had no greenhouse gases would be this dashed red line, which is the Planck curve, you know, no greenhouse gases. And there's actually more radiation coming to space from Antarctica because of the greenhouse gas CO2. So you can see the CO2 feature here is actually above the curve rather than below the curve as it is over most of the Earth. So there's as you get close enough to the South Pole, the greenhouse gases are all negative. They actually make the Earth cool faster than it would without the gases. So there are many subtleties here that are always brushed over, and but they are important. Now you might ask, why does this happen? This is not the venue to talk about this, but let me tell you at least a rough idea. So this is, you can think of greenhouse gases as like paint. That's you've painted the Earth with carbon dioxide and methane, and they're like the pigments in paint, would make it red or green. And if you've got a good paint and you paint a barn red, it'll look nice and red. And then suppose you decide to put a second coat of paint on the barn. Will it make any difference? And the answer is if the first coat was good paint, you put a second coat on, you won't see the slightest difference. And so that's called saturation. And that's the situation we're in now with carbon dioxide and methane. They're heavily saturated. So there's so much of them in the atmosphere already that if you double the amount, it's like putting a second coat of paint on a barn. It makes a little difference, but not very much. So now let's talk about how you convert this change of radiation to space into temperatures. And again, there's some interesting personalities involved here. So I'll talk about, first of all, Joseph Stefan. Joseph Stefan was a Slovenian physicist who spent most of his career at the University of Vienna during the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he was a superb experimentalist. He could measure things precisely that nobody else could figure out how to do. And one of the things he measured was how much thermal radiation comes out of a body that's cooling by radiation, like the Earth cools. And by ingenious experiments, he was able to show that the amount of radiation coming out goes as the fourth power of the absolute temperature. This is a huge factor. You don't often see factors of 4 like this in physics. And the experiments were so well done that there was just no question that this was true. but nobody understood it theoretically. And so Stefan had a second talent besides being an expert experimentalist. He was a good judge of people. So when this young man at the time, Ludwig Boltzmann, showed up saying, Professor Stefan, I'd like to work for you, and can you give me some physics problem that I can work on so I can make a name for myself? He said, well, why don't you see if you can explain this T to the fourth law? And Boltzmann, a very young man at the time, in fact, succeeded in doing that. He showed that this followed from two things that were already known at that time, from the theory of thermodynamics and Maxwell's new theory of radiation. At least for a physicist, you know, the way he did it, it's almost like a piece of poetry. It's just so beautiful and simple, you know, a few lines, you got it. But anyway, the important thing about that is that, without going into the details, it tells you that if you change the temperature by a 1%, then you change, if you change the flux by 1% by increasing CO2, doubling CO2, you only change the temperature by 1/4%. So that factor of 4 decreases the percent change of the warming. So all of this is no one really disputes any of this who knows anything about radiation transfer. So the effects of greenhouse gases to begin with are extremely small. It's difficult to understand how one could have panicked the world into thinking that this is a problem. It's not a problem. So before I get back to that, let's talk a little bit about methane, which is the key issue for cattle. And again, I urge you to look at the scales of figures. This looks like a lot of methane increase, methane concentration. This is by year. The year 2021, here we are at 2025, this year. Looks like it's going up very rapidly, but look where it starts, 189, and it ends at 193. So this increase is just barely 1%. But by careful graphing, you can make things look dangerous, which are actually very, very small. And that's routinely done in the climate area. All right, so methane is increasing, but the rate is extremely slow. It would take about 140 years at this current rate to double, and that's an unusually fast rate. It's probably never going to double. But it would not matter if it did. Okay, here's a similar curve to the one I just showed with Planck and Schwarzschild, and this is what happens if you take methane and double it. You go from the black curve to the red curve, and there's a difference in the region where methane is stored, but you can just barely see it. The black and red curve overlap over most of the energy range here. If you take all of the methane away, you get the green curve. So methane is a much weaker greenhouse gas than CO2, much weaker. That's another issue. So let me just tell you briefly. When the alarmists talk about how dangerous cows are and methane is, they say, well, a methane molecule is 30 times more potent than a CO2 molecule. You will often hear that. And yes, that's true. But what they don't tell you is that the rate of increase of CO2 is 300 times faster than methane, and so you'll have to divide 30 by 300, and so that means the effect of methane is 1/10 that of CO2. So methane is a small fraction of the CO2 warming. It's not a very important gas, and CO2 itself is not very important either. But it's also true that a measurable fraction of the methane in the atmosphere comes from cattle. You can easily estimate that. So this blue line is the methane in the atmosphere from cattle starting from 1985, when there were fewer cattle, to today, where there are more, and you can see it's increasing, but not very fast, and the total amount of methane that's in the atmosphere from cattle is maybe a fifth or a sixth of the inventory there. So it's a measurable amount, but it's certainly not the major amount. The major amount comes from rice paddies, and Deborah likes to say people are not demanding that we stop eating rice, but we're supposed to stop, raising cattle. I don't really see it. Okay. So as I mentioned as we came in, if you put in the numbers, I've tried to give you the flavor of how you put in the numbers, and you can, and there's nothing hand-waving about this. This is all pretty solid. If you killed all the cattle so they don't emit any methane, and you get rid of that blue line, the 1/5 or 1/6 of the total methane in the atmosphere, you only cool the earth by 0.07 centigrade. And so if you ask, what do New Zealand's goals for methane reduction do? Well, that's probably 100th part of this, or maybe 1,000th part of this. So it's even smaller, because this is for killing all the cattle. And the measures that are taking, or thrust on farmers here, have almost no effect on the amount of methane coming out, comparing to killing all the cattle. So it's absurd. All right. Well, okay. There's a problem with this if you're alarmist, and the problem is that you really have a hard time getting political support by saying that the Earth is going to die if the temperature goes up by 0.7 centigrade from, say, doubling CO2, and much less from doubling methane. And so the way alarmism is justified is that it's assumed that there are enormous positive feedbacks in the climate system. So a little warming that you can reliably calculate from increasing methane or increasing CO2 is supposed to be multiplied by factors of 3 or 4 or 5 because of positive feedback. And so it's, I like to joke, it's affirmative action for greenhouse gases, which are fundamentally very puny, control factors for temperature. So you need to somehow make that look a lot more threatening. Well, there's a major problem with this assumption, and that is that almost no natural systems have positive feedback. Most natural systems have negative feedback, so these estimates that I have made and showed you here, they're probably too big. They're not too small. But if it's like most natural systems, other things will change in the Earth, in the atmosphere, in the oceans to decrease the effect of increasing CO2, not increase it. That almost never happens, and that's even dignified with the name, the Chatelier's principle, but this was a French chemist who looked at lots and lots of natural systems, and he found that almost all of them had negative feedback. And it's often stated this way: when a simple system, thermodynamic equilibrium subject to a change in concentration, temperature, volume, pressure, increasing CO2. Number one, the system changes to a new equilibrium, yes. And two, this change partly counteracts. It counteracts as negative, counteracts. It doesn't proact, it counteracts. All right, so insane. Now, let me quickly end, because I'd like to open the floor for questions, with a discussion of the benefits of more CO2. And so there's no question that CO2 has greatly benefited the Earth already. Satellites measure the greening of the Earth, and there's no other explanation for the greening of the Earth that's been observed over the last 40 years except fertilization by CO2. And so this is, when I talk to my academic friends back in America, almost nobody knows anything about agriculture, so I ask them, what is this crop? And some of them say, well, maybe it's marijuana, or, the degree of ignorance is amazing. But this is soybeans. And if you look at it, you can see this is genetically modified soybeans. And does anyone immediately see why? Why is this genetically modified soybeans? Roundup ready soybeans. It doesn't have any weeds. Okay. You know, when I was a kid, they didn't have this type of soybean, and you'd go to a soybean field and it'd be full of weeds. You know, the poor farm, it's hard to cultivate a field like this. But now there are never any weeds because of this particular variety of soybeans where you can spray a herbicide that will kill every weed in sight. But there's a gene change in the soybean that makes it impervious to this herbicide. I don't know. Deborah tells me they don't grow soybeans very much in New Zealand, but it's a major crop in the United States and Brazil and China, other parts of the world. It's probably the biggest source of protein around, you know, vegetable protein. I'm getting short of time, so I won't talk about hemoglobin. But I was mentioning to Deborah this afternoon that if you dig up the roots of these have these huge root nodules. They're as big as a pea. And if you split a soybean root nodule, it's bright red. You know, looks like the color of blood. And the reason it looks like the color of blood is full of hemoglobin. So the soybean and other legumes are one of the few plants that makes hemoglobin just like we. And the hemoglobin is just as red as our hemoglobin. But the purpose of the hemoglobin is to pump the oxygen out of the roots where nitrogen is fixed. So these things, you don't need nitrogen fertilizer. The bacteria in the root nodules take nitrogen from the air and make nitrogen fertilizer. So, but it's kind of interesting that the same molecule that transmits oxygen to our cells so that we can breathe, and it's considered a benefit for our metabolism. For the soybean, it goes the other way. It pumps it out because it's a poison to the microorganisms. A lot of interesting things about soybeans. It's what you make tofu from. Well, there are two main reasons that CO2 has helped plant life on Earth. And the most important one for the open air is that plants need less water if you have more carbon dioxide in the air. So let me briefly explain why that. The reason for that is that the plant has to suck CO2 out of the surrounding air, and to do that it has to have holes in its leaf that let CO2 molecules diffuse in. But you know, a leaf is pretty moist. You know, if you squeeze it, it's watery. And so for every CO2 molecule that diffuses into the leaf of a plant to be turned into sugar, 100 water molecules diffuse out the other way. So plants are extremely wasteful in their use of water because of the need to have all these holes in their leaves. And so if you double the amount of CO2 in the air, the plant only needs half as many holes, and so it only loses half as much water. So the more CO2 you have, the less water the plant needs, and the better it's able to withstand drought. So the greening of the earth that you see from satellites is almost all due to this first one here. But there's a second one, and many of you know that in real greenhouses around the world, the operators pump in huge amounts of CO2, so they double, triple, quadruple the amount of CO2 around the plants. You have to pay for it, it's not cheap. But the resulting fruits and flowers and other products are so much better that the additional price that you get from the high quality greenhouse grown things is worth the cost of the CO2, more than pays for itself. And there's no problem with water. If you're running a greenhouse, you just add a little more water. There's glass to keep it from evaporating. And so there's another factor coming into play here, and this goes back to the beginnings of life on Earth, and this is called photorespiration. So let's quickly discuss this. And